Amusement parks that host thrilling rides have been around for over 100 years now. Some of these parks are open year-round, constantly running these attractions all day, every day for thrill seekers to enjoy. When you have some of these impossible-looking attractions running for so long, human error can slip in and cause many injuries to the passengers present on these rides, and in some cases, these injuries can be fatal. Today we'll be going over an iceberg that I created that covers many different incidents from amusement parks all over the world. Even if you're an expert on the subject, this iceberg is guaranteed to have something you haven't heard of yet. This is the Disturbing Amusement Park Incidents Iceberg Explained. Galaxy Spin. Galaxy Spin is a smaller coaster located at Fun Spot America theme park in Kissimmee, Florida. It's considered to be a Wild Mouse style coaster, which basically means it has very sharp turns with carts being wider than the tracks to simulate hanging over the edge. On August 3rd, 2023, a 6-year-old boy came to the park with his family and rode on the Galaxy Spin ride with his 10-year-old older brother. About halfway through the ride, as the ride was reaching peak height, the boy managed to stand up through the lap bar and was launched out at one of the sharp turns. The boy fell about 20 to 25 feet and sustained injuries to his head, lip, and hip, but was ultimately okay. It's important to note that there was nothing wrong with the ride itself, as park staff made sure the boy was secured before the ride started, and after investigating the ride, officials found nothing wrong with the safety measures of the ride. There was an empty seat between the boy and his 10-year-old brother, which could have made it easier for him to wriggle through the lap bar, but it's still kind of impressive how he was able to stand completely up, especially while the ride was moving. Top Thrill Dragster. The Top Thrill Dragster is a ride located at Cedar Point in Sandusky, Ohio. When the ride first opened, it was the tallest and fastest roller coaster in the world, reaching speeds of 120 miles per hour at 400 feet in the sky, which makes it sound like this entry is going to be really bad, but it was actually something that happened to someone off the ride which caused the incident. In summer 2021, when the ride was operating all day and the line was full of people excited for their opportunity to ride it, a piece of metal the size of a fist launched off the Top Thrill Dragster, hitting a woman in line right in the back of her head. The woman immediately collapsed, which caused an intense panic where many people started to run away out of fear that more pieces were going to fly off the ride at them. The piece of metal flew off the ride because the bolts keeping it in place dislodged, which caused it to shoot out at high speeds right at the line of people. As for the woman who got hit with the piece of metal, she suffered a skull fracture, and according to the lawsuit against Cedar Point, she was deemed permanently disabled. Son of Beast. The Son of Beast is a large wooden coaster at Kings Island in Mason, Ohio. It was at one point the tallest and fastest wooden coaster in the entire world, reaching heights of 218 feet and max speeds of 80 miles per hour. The Son of Beast would only last about 9 years, which is very short for wooden coasters, as it had a ton of structural problems, which led to many complaints of minor injuries right after the ride opened due to bumps during the ride. Small bumps were the least of riders' worries though, as in 2001, 2 separate riders broke their necks within a 4-week window of riding the Son of Beast. It is important to note though that the riders had pre-existing medical conditions that made them more susceptible to the injury. A few years later in 2006, the Son of Beast would be in the spotlight once again when 27 riders faced severe injuries after part of the track collapsed, causing the riders to sink 5 inches, causing a fast jolting stop to the ride. All 27 riders needed to go to the hospital, and all but 2 needed to stay overnight to evaluate and treat their injuries. Luckily, none of the injuries were fatal, but it didn't stop the ride from being on the hot seat of closing. Well, 3 years later in 2009, the Son of Beast would finally close when a woman complained of a severe head injury after riding the ride. Immediately after the investigation of that incident, the Son of Beast would be demolished and replaced. The Dueling Dragons Incident. The Dueling Dragons, later called the Dragon Challenge, is a ride at Universal Studios in the Harry Potter section of the park. The ride was a dual roller coaster featuring 2 tracks that riders could choose between that were both dragon themed. One side was called Chinese Fireball, and the other was called Hungarian Horntail. The two tracks passed each other at 55 miles per hour, with only an 18-inch gap between each other. This just looks disastrous from an outside perspective, and it was, as it caused two separate incidents during the ride's lifespan. The first incident occurred in 2011 when a man who was riding the dueling dragons was hit in the eye by a foreign object during the section where the two tracks passed by each other. The man had to have the struck eye removed, which really sucks considering he was already blind in his other eye, so this incident left him completely blind. Just 2 weeks later, another rider was struck in the head and leg at the same point where the two rides intersect by a foreign object. These two incidents caused Universal to make changes to the ride, and now only one track goes at a time. It is a shame that the ride had to change, as it was a pretty cool spectacle, and it wasn't even the ride's fault, as Universal had several signs and warnings telling riders to keep all loose articles off the ride. Terminal Velocity. This entry is our first where the incident isn't from a traditional roller coaster, as it's more of an extreme stunt attraction. Terminal Velocity was located at Extreme World, Wisconsin, and features the riders being ascended 100 feet in the air before hanging by a harness and dropping 52 miles per hour in a free fall to a safety net that's hoisted above the ground. In August 2010, a 12-year-old girl from Florida saw the attraction on TV and convinced her parents to take her there for a family trip. Her parents had to sign a consent form, as you're technically supposed to be 13 to ride, but what happened next had nothing to do with her age, as when she took the 100-foot freefall, the net wasn't hoisted above the ground and was instead laying flat on the ground. She hit the concrete at 52 miles per hour and was knocked completely unconscious. Her father reportedly thought she was immediately deceased, as there was blood rushing from her ears and nose, and they couldn't feel a pulse at first. She was rushed to the hospital and thankfully lived, suffering 10 fractures in her back and a skull fracture, although she had to endure years of physical therapy as well. The ride operator was thankfully charged with first-degree reckless injury, as it was pretty much the bare minimum of his important job to make sure the safety net was active. Such an avoidable incident here. The Smiler Cart Crash. The Smiler is a ride present at a theme park in the UK that holds the record for the most loops on a single coaster, with 14 loops total. The ride's premise is to make the passengers as loopy as possible, obviously with the many loops, but also with things like mist spraying at you and large screens displaying hypnotic swirl effects as you progress through the ride. The Smiler was a very anticipated ride for thrill seekers for its contents, but initially it didn't live up to the hype as it had a pretty rough start. During the initial press preview for the ride got caught hanging upside down, and it took several hours to safely get the passengers off the ride. For many weeks after its official final release, it again faced many stallouts and malfunctions. It wasn't until 2015 where these malfunctions caused major injury when a stalled out empty test coaster was stuck on the middle of the tracks. The ride operators didn't know this test cart was stopped on the tracks, and despite the computer telling them that the sensors sensed something on the tracks, they still sent out the next cart full of people out for the ride. This cart, full of 16 people, slammed into the test cart at high speeds, and it took over 4 hours for them to be rescued from the cart, despite all 16 of them being very injured. Thankfully there were no fatalities, but sadly due to blood loss, 2 women had to have their legs amputated, with I'm sure a lot more suffering long-time chronic injuries. The ride stayed open past this incident, and has had a clean track record since, but it's still so frustrating that this one was due completely to incompetence from the operators, who didn't just listen to the ride's computer in the first place. Omaha Carnival Scalping. This entry comes from a carnival ride instead of an established theme park, which I'm surprised there aren't more major incidents associated with carnival rides, given their very sketchy nature. This incident in specific comes from a Cinco de Mayo carnival in Omaha, Nebraska, where the ride called King's Crown was present. King's Crown was a teacup style ride where riders would spin around very fast in circular carts rotating around each other. A 12-year-old girl who was riding the King's Crown had gotten her hair caught on the back of the ride, which caused so much fast friction on her scalp that it tore her scalp completely off, causing the ride to emergency stop because of the rider's screams from the sight of this. The girl was rushed to the hospital where she would ultimately live, but since the day of the incident, she has had 2 head surgeries, 3 skin grafts, an eye surgery, and 28 blood transfusions. There's a video taken by someone across from her on the ride, which shows her laughing seconds before the incident, which is just very disturbing to watch. Python Coaster slogan. The Python Coaster was a roller coaster at Busch Gardens in Tampa, Florida. It opened in 1976 and was one of the first modern roller coasters to actually go upside down, as it had this vortex spin halfway through the ride that flipped riders upside down through 2 loops. The coaster opened alongside a tagline that went with it that read, "I challenged the Python and lived." Well, in the same summer that the Python opened, a 39-year-old man rode the ride and started to feel ill afterwards. The man had an undisclosed heart condition, which it isn't known whether or not he was cleared to even ride the Python in the first place. After being rushed to the hospital, he shortly died soon after. Busch Gardens immediately changed the tagline after the incident. Superman Tower of Power. The Superman Tower of Power is a tower drop ride located at Six Flags Kentucky Kingdom. The ride reaches max heights of 325 feet, and like I mentioned, is a tower drop ride where riders are fastened around a tower-like structure and raised in the air before being suddenly dropped repeatedly. In 2007, the ride was operating as normal, but as the riders were ascending, ride operators heard unusual screaming. This was because the cables from the ride were snapping off, whipping and tangling around the passengers' bodies and necks. Instead of hitting the emergency stop, the operator was screaming for help, and the ride started to fall like how it was supposed to. Finally, the emergency stop was hit, but not before a 13-year-old Caitlin Lassiter lost both of her feet because one of the cables wrapped around her feet before the fall, tearing them off completely. Six Flags has since provided lifetime care for Caitlin, and Caitlin regularly makes efforts to speak about the issue of amusement park safety. Disney's Mission Space accidents. Mission Space is a space-themed motion simulator located at Epcot at Disney World. The ride presents a large screen in front of the riders and takes many sharp dips and rattles in order to simulate space travel, and just looks like motion sickness incarnate. From June 2005 to June 2006, paramedics had to treat 194 riders total. The most common complaints were dizziness, nausea, and vomiting. Of those 194 guests, 25 people passed out, 26 suffered difficulty breathing, and 16 reported chest pains or irregular heartbeats. One of these riders was a 4-year-old boy who died shortly after riding the ride. The Orange County Medical Examiner's Office stated he died as a result of a pre-existing undiagnosed heart condition, but his family still filed a lawsuit against Disney, claiming that their son shouldn't have been let on the ride in the first place. Another rider was a 49-year-old woman who fell ill after riding the ride and died at a nearby hospital shortly after. It was later found out that she died from a bleeding brain caused by high blood pressure, not due to the ride itself. After this years-long mess of discomfort and injury, Disney made 2 options for the ride, one being the intense version we know, and the other being a much less intense experience, suitable for younger kids and those with health problems. Ride of Steel. The Ride of Steel is a large steel roller coaster at Six Flags Darien Lake in Buffalo, New York. The ride's main appeal comes from the first drop, where the ride slowly ascends to 200 feet in the sky before dropping at 75 miles per hour. I've been on this ride several times actually, as Darien Lake isn't too far from me. In 2011, a man named James Hackamer came to Darien Lake with his family. James was a veteran of the Iraq War and had his legs removed due to an IED explosion, so he was in a wheelchair during his trip to Darien Lake. He did head to the information booth to confirm what rides he could safely ride, but none of the staff told him he couldn't ride on the Ride of Steel, so he made his way onto the ride. As the ride descended from the first massive hill, James went to reach for his hat, and that's when he fell out of the cart and fell 150 feet to his death. It's important to note that there is a sign near the front of the ride that states all riders must have both legs to ride, so it was a complete lack of knowledge from the operators that caused this incident to happen. Corpse in SeaWorld tank. In 1999, a 27-year-old man attending SeaWorld by himself decided to stay past close and hide from security despite there being several nighttime security guards that patrolled the theme park past close. The man changed into his bathing suit and snuck into the whale exhibit, getting into the tank of Tilikum, who at the time was the largest killer whale in captivity. And yes, it's that Tilikum, but topic for a different video maybe. The next morning, the staff found the man dead and draped over the back of Tilikum, who was playfully moving his body around. His swim shorts were found not on him, instead floating on the opposite side of the tank. It's unclear whether the man died from drowning or hypothermia, as the water was 55 degrees Fahrenheit when he climbed in. The man was later identified, and it was revealed he was in jail just a week earlier for stealing a candy bar, so he was sort of a harmless drifter of sorts. Orlando Freefall. The Orlando Freefall is a drop tower located in Icon Park in Orlando, Florida. This tower in specific reaches over 400 feet in height as it makes its many freefall drops, which is actually the tallest freestanding drop tower ride in the entire world. In 2022, just a few weeks after the tower opened, a 14-year-old boy named Tyree Sampson attempted the Icon Park with his family and decided to ride the Orlando Freefall. As the ride was making its first freefall, Tyree slipped out of his restraints and fell 100 feet face first into the concrete below, where he died instantly. The ride's operators had an extreme lack of urgency, as it was a while before they stopped the ride, so the other riders at the time were stuck on the ride after watching one of their fellow passengers fly out. The entire incident was unfortunately captured on video, and it's seriously eerie. The reason for Tyree slipping out was because he was almost 100 pounds over the ride's weight limit, and ride operators did not stop him from getting on the ride, which allowed him to slip between the seat and his harness since it wasn't fastened completely. The Orlando Freefall has since been dismantled after a long fight from Tyree's family. The Texas Giant. The Texas Giant is a large wooden coaster located in Arlington, Texas. It opened in 1990 and at that point was considered the tallest wooden coaster in the world, reaching a max height of a little over 150 feet. In summer 2013, a 52-year-old woman was riding the Texas Giant when she was ejected from the third row of the cart just when the ride was descending the first massive hill. She fell 75 feet onto a metal support beam before finally landing on a metal roof of the tunnel below the ride. The reason for the incident is actually still not fully known, as the lap bar restraint didn't fully lock despite ride operators saying the safety sensors were working completely fine that day. A woman a few ride cycles before this was claiming that her leg got trapped on the ride as the gates for the ride were closing, so it could have been not completely working fine that day despite what the operators were saying. One important thing to note is that the woman was very overweight, so it's believed that the restraints maybe didn't account for her body shape, but that is such a horrible reason for this occurring. Disney Big Thunder Mountain Crash. Big Thunder Mountain is a coaster located in Magic Kingdom in Disney World. The ride isn't too fast or reaches too big of heights, as it's made for a family audience. The ride is mine-themed, where riders ride through different caves and mountains in a train. In 1998, a 5-year-old boy had his foot wedged between the passenger car and the ride's platform, which caused the boy to have all the toes on his foot be amputated. In 2003, a 22-year-old man was riding in the front row of the Big Thunder Mountain when the ride entered one of its dark tunnels. As the train entered the tunnel, the cart derailed due to a mechanical failure on the wheel because of improper maintenance. The front car that the man was riding in collided with the front of the train, which caused blunt force trauma to his head and chest, killing him. The 10 other riders present were also injured but ultimately lived. Disney has since then made the ride much safer, and an incident hasn't occurred on the ride since. Action Park. I can make an hour-long video on Action Park, which check out Defunctland's video if you want an entire breakdown on it, but I don't have that much time, so here's a very brief rundown of the park and its incidents. Action Park opened in New Jersey in 1978 and was infamous for its poor safety regulations and carefree attitude towards literally everything. Its most common nickname was Class Action Park, as there was dozens of injuries that occurred during its 18 years in operation. Along with these injuries, there were 6 deaths that occurred from 1980 to 1987. In 1980, a 19-year-old died on the Alpine slide ride, which had horrible safety regulations, after his car jumped the track, causing him to hit his head on a large rock, putting him in a coma where he died a few days later. 2 years later in 1982, a 15-year-old would drown in the tidal wave pool, as this wave pool had hundreds of people in it, with only 2 staffed lifeguards at all times. The artificial waves were also very strong, making it very hard to swim in the deep end. It obtained the nickname the Grave Pool because there were several more accidents that occurred there. A few weeks later in 1982, a 27-year-old man would die on the kayak experience as his kayak flipped, and while he was standing in the water, he stood on exposed wiring from the underwater fans, electrocuting him. 2 years later in 1984, another 20-year-old guest would drown in the tidal wave pool for the same reasons as the first one. They never fixed the issues with the overcrowding and strength of artificial waves, and never even fixed the simple issue of understaffing with the lifeguards. That same summer, a 5th person would lose their life when a 20-year-old at the Roaring Rapids, which is a ride that simulates whitewater rafting, would drown. The reason for this was because his raft would flip and he would become trapped under the water, which was apparently a common issue with this ride in particular. The final death came in 1987, when again, an 18-year-old would drown in the tidal wave pool. They still didn't fix any of the issues from the wave pool, despite 2 others previously dying in it. Again, this was very brief, but go watch the Funklands video after this one if you're more interested on the complete breakdown of Action Park. Disney Epcot Plane Crash. This entry is a bit different from the other entries because this one isn't from an attraction or a ride, but it still pertains to an incident that happened at an amusement park and is still interesting, so I figured I'd include it. In November 1984, a single-engine plane was attempting to fly from Greer, South Carolina to Disney World, Florida for a family vacation. Aboard the plane was a married couple with their 1-year-old daughter and 2 other children who were supposedly also family members. The plane had to make an emergency landing just 10 miles from where they were trying to land in Kissimmee, Florida, and they noticed an empty part of the Epcot parking lot that looked safe to land in. As they were descending, they clipped a light pole that was in the parking lot, sending the plane into the populated part of the parking lot, where it skimmed across nearly a dozen unoccupied vehicles before coming to rest on top of a car. Luckily, no one in the parking lot was hurt, as like I mentioned, all of the parked cars it crashed into were unoccupied at the time, but the married couple piloting the plane, along with their 1-year-old daughter, unfortunately died. The 2 other children they were with, aged 3 and 5, did survive, however, if there's any silver lining. There's actually another fatal crash that occurred almost in the same spot 3 years later when an airshow pilot for Epcot nosedived about a mile from this crash, so weird coincidence there. Batman Coaster Disaster. One of our more infamous entries, as it's kind of used as a boogeyman story now for kids going to amusement parks. The Batman ride is a large steel coaster at Six Flags over Georgia. It reaches top speeds of over 55 miles per hour and features many loops and hills where at some points riders are only 8 feet above the ground. In summer 2008, a 17-year-old teen lost his hat while riding the Batman ride. After getting off the ride, he noticed his hat fell into a restricted zone that runs underneath the coaster that is behind 2 different fences. These fences had several do not enter signs on them, but it didn't matter as the boy jumped over both fences and went into the restricted zone to retrieve his hat. As he was in the restricted zone, the coaster was running a lap, and as it passed over him, a passenger's foot hit the boy in the head and internally decapitated him. What's insane is that the passenger that hit the boy's head didn't receive any injuries to their leg despite hitting the boy at 55 miles per hour. The family tried to sue following this incident, but they were denied as there were several do not enter signs along with the 2 fences. The Big Dipper Crash. The Big Dipper was a large wooden coaster that was located at Battersea Park in London. The coaster contained 3 different carts that passengers can sit in and opened in 1951, so it was pretty old and was at a time where safety regulations were at an all-time low. In 1972, a coaster full of people were getting on the Big Dipper and getting ready to ride. As the ride took off and began to ascend up the first 120-foot hill, A train being hoisted up to the start of the ride broke loose from its haulage rope. The emergency rollback brake failed, causing the coaster to roll backwards towards the station. The train gathered speed and the back cart jumped the rails and crashed through a barrier, with the 2 other carts crashing on top of it. This caused the death of 5 children that were on the ride and injuring 13 others. A report that was done on the coaster after the crash revealed over 50 faults on the ride. The ride manager and engineer responsible for the ride were tried for and acquitted of manslaughter. Disney America Sings. America Sings was a smaller and slower ride at Disneyland in California. It featured rotating stages as animatronics would sing and dance to a song about America's history. In 1974, an 18-year-old Disneyland employee was working as a greeter for the ride, where she dressed in theme and greeted guests before they got on the ride. During one of her shifts and loops of the ride, she was heard screaming by a fellow employee, and when they went to check on her, she was crushed in between the rotating stage during a ride intermission. It's unclear if this was due to a misstep on her part or inadequate training, as she was only hired a couple weeks before the incident, but it was a terrifying sight nonetheless. A sad detail about this entry, and I'm not sure if this is true, but apparently just a few hours before the incident, she would call her parents and tell them she was in love and ask them for permission to get engaged. Yeah, pretty awful stuff. Fujin Raijin. The Fujin Raijin 2 was a large steel roller coaster at the Expo Land Park located in Japan. It contained 6 carts and reached speeds of up to 50 miles per hour, with riders being secured in an over-the-shoulder harness and lap bar. In spring of 2007, the cart was full of riders who were ready to ride the Fujin Raijin. The ride climbed the first hill without a problem, but as the coaster was climbing the second hill, the left wheel axle on one of the middle carts snapped, causing the cart to flip over onto a support handrail as the ride was still moving. The ride finally stopped, but not before a 19-year-old woman was killed from her head hitting the handrail when the cart flipped. The other riders had to sit there watching and stuck in their restraints as the 19-year-old woman bled out, not being able to help at all. Truly devastating. Thunder River Rapids. Thunder River Rapids was a river rapid ride located at Dreamworld Theme Park in Australia. A river rapid ride is a ride that simulates whitewater rafting. The ride uses a lot of obstacles and bumps to create the feeling of the rapids as you float fastly down the stream, although some rides like this one use conveyor belts to carry riders upstream. In 2016, 4 riders would get their rafts stuck on the conveyor belt, which caused the next raft in line to smack it at high speeds, causing the riders to flip out of the raft. As they were in the water, they got stuck in the machinery and died. The ride closed immediately after the incident and never reopened since, which is honestly surprising given that most of the time, the rides will stay open for years after a fatal incident occurs. Disney Matterhorn Bobsleds Incident. The Matterhorn Bobsleds is a steel roller coaster that runs through a fake snowy mountain located in Disneyland, California. The ride consists of 2 separate tracks that run parallel to each other for much of the ride, intertwining and eventually deviating from each other at the loading areas. The ride also consists of bobsled-esque carts, where riders sit in a single file line, hence the name Matterhorn Bobsleds. There has been 2 major incidents that occurred on the ride, both causing fatal injuries. The first being in 1964, when a 15-year-old boy was sitting in the middle seat during the course of the ride. Apparently, the boy somehow unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up during one of the darker sections of the mountain, where he then hit his head on the side of the concrete mountain interior, falling out of the cart and landing next to the track. He would then be rushed to the hospital and die 4 days later, never regaining consciousness. The second fatality occurred 20 years later in 1984 when a 48-year-old woman was riding in the backseat of the ride. Somehow her seatbelt became undone and she fell from the cart. She was then bouncing on the tracks for over 30 seconds, trying to stand up before the next bobsled cart in rotation came around the corner and hit her, striking her head and torso and killing her instantly. A family that was riding a gondola that passes over the ride and through the fake mountain witnessed the entire thing as they were heard screaming first when the incident happened. It's still unclear on how the seatbelt became undone, with many claiming it was a fault with the ride operators not checking the woman's seatbelt completely. This incident caused Disney to immediately change the seatbelts on the bobsleds, and there hasn't been an incident since on them. Ghost Train Fire. The Ghost Train was an attraction at Luna Park, Sydney in New South Wales, Australia. The ride wasn't very fast or exciting, and was mainly a show ride where carts would enter a near pitch black building with many twists and turns as dancing animatronics of skeletons and other spooky characters act as you pass through the building. In summer 1979, a fire broke out while a ride loop was happening that had 35 people on the ride at the time. Thick smoke began to emerge from the doors of the building, causing ride operators to pull the fire alarm and send firefighters inside. Due to a combination of low water pressure, understaffing within the park, and inadequate coverage of the ghost train by the park's fire hose system, the fire completely consumed the ride, and it took over an hour to control the fire, which sadly resulted in the death of 6 children and 1 adult man. What started the fire was up to debate, with some claiming arson, while others claiming a malfunction of some of the ride's machines. The investigation reopened nearly 10 years later in 1987, but no new evidence was found. Kankari Pendulum. The Kankari Pendulum is a pendulum-style ride located at an amusement park in India, where riders sit in a giant loop around a swinging pendulum about 40 to 60 feet in the air. One day, as the ride was at its full capacity of 32 passengers, the metal shaft holding the loop where riders would sit snapped in half while the pendulum was swinging, sending riders into the base of the metal structure of the ride and then into the ground below the ride. All of the riders were severely injured, and 2 riders unfortunately died from their injuries. There's an entire video taken by someone off the ride of the incident, and while you can't see any of the riders getting injured, it's still pretty disturbing to watch. The Verrückt Disaster. Verrückt was a giant water slide located at the Schlitterbahn Water Park in Kansas City. In summer 2014 when it released, it was the tallest water slide in the world with a height of 168 feet. Riders would slide down in 3-seater rafts that were known to bump off the slide and become airborne, nearly allowing you to hit your head on the safety netting that's held above the slide, which was a common complaint for riders. Well, in summer 2016, Caleb Schwab, the 10-year-old son of Kansas State Representative Scott Schwab, was killed while riding the ride. The raft he was riding in went airborne during the ascent of the second hump, and he struck a metal support bar that held up the netting, decapitating him. The 2 other passengers behind him in the raft were injured in the incident as well, one suffering a broken jaw, while the other suffered a facial bone fracture and needed stitches. It was then discovered that even in the park's safety test, the rafts would sometimes become airborne and hit the netting above, so this whole incident could have been completely avoided if they would make the necessary safety changes to the slide. There's several photos of the red stain that Caleb's blood left on the slide as his remains slid down, and they are disturbing. Haunted Castle Fire. The Haunted Castle was a walk-through haunted house attraction located at Six Flags in New Jersey. The house, or castle, was huge and had a ton of different tight corridors with many twists and turns for attendees to get scared when park employees would dress in theme and scare those who walked through it. In 1984, while people were making their way through the house as normal, a large fire broke out and spread quickly due to the mass amount of flammable decorations inside the house. It's still to this day unclear why the fire broke out, with reports from one person who said they saw a young boy using a cigarette lighter to light his way through the pitch-black corridors, which caused the rubber padding on the walls to ignite, but again, nothing is confirmed. As the fire spread, it trapped many of the attendees inside, and due to the maze-like corridors, it made it an almost impossible task to escape. One girl even stating that she thought the fire was just for show and a part of the attraction. The fire killed 8 teenagers in total that were trapped inside, and when firefighters showed up, they reportedly said that the bodies were so burnt they thought they were mannequin props for the castle, which is just awful. Formosa Fun Coast Mass Fire. This incident for sure is the one with the most casualties, as it was a pretty massive fire at a large festival. Formosa Fun Coast is a water park in New Taipei City in Taiwan, and in 2015 was hosting a festival called the Color Play Asia Party, which is a festival held every year in different areas around Asia, where typically a large concert is going on, while large amounts of this colored cornstarch powder is sprayed around the festival. The colored cornstarch powder was inspired by the colored powder used in the Hindu religious festival, Holi, also called the Festival of Colors. In 2013, when the festival was being held for the first time, experts warned that the colored powder might cause a dust explosion if the material was combustible. Well, coming back to the festival being held at Formosa Fun Coast, if you were anywhere near the stage, you were basically covered head to toe in this colored powder. Some reports claim that the people right by the stage were up to ankle deep in the powder as well. Seemingly out of nowhere, during the middle of the festival, a giant combustion occurred and lit hundreds of the attendees on fire, burning 500 total, with 200 in critical condition and 15 being killed. It isn't known entirely why the combustion occurred, but many claim it was because of the hot stage lights that were beating on the many puddles of the colored powder, despite the warnings they received to not use the powder near high temperatures. The sheer amount of injured people all at once caused a lack of resource problem for the hospitals nearby and caused many of the burn victims to wait in pain for proper care for their wounds. Over 50 hospitals across Taiwan needed to be used for this incident, with many of the doctors having to be young medical students. Since it was such a large festival, there's several videos on the incident, and when the fire first erupts, it is pretty disturbing. I mean, this literally looks like hell. Lake Compounce Curse. I can make an entire video on this one as it's very interesting, but I'll give you a very brief rundown. Lake Compounce Amusement Park is the oldest continuously operating theme park in North America. The name of Lake Compounce comes from Native American chieftain John Compound, who has a fair amount of legends behind him and his death, which only helps the cursed beliefs behind the lake. In October 1846, the original owner of the lake, Gad Norton, allowed a local scientist to use Lake Compounce as a location for a series of experiments with electricity and explosives. The experiments drew crowds of spectators from the local area, and Gad took notice of the crowds and was inspired to transform the area into a larger park to attempt to draw in more visitors. Over the years, more and more attractions would open at the lake, and it would become a full-on theme park by the 1950s. Since then, several injuries have occurred there, and 4 separate incidents have occurred that resulted in deaths. Those are: first, in 1999, a 16-year-old park employee was knocked over and then crushed by the Tornado Ride, which is a large stationary spinning ride with dangling seats. The employee died from his injuries in the hospital 10 hours later. Then, a year later in 2000, a 6-year-old boy fell into the lake when the tube he had used on the lake plunge water slide overturned. The boy was found unconscious after a 20-minute search and died 6 days later in the hospital. A year later in 2001, a train from the Boulder Dash roller coaster ride was sent on a 60-mile-per-hour preliminary test run when it struck and killed a 23-year-old groundskeeper who had been cutting weeds by the side of the ride and who didn't know that the ride was in operation at the time. The last and most strange death occurred in 2004 when a 5-year-old boy was killed when he was struck by a fallen tree branch from a decaying 80-foot red oak tree that hung right above the park's mini golf course. These 4 instances and the overall strange nature of the lake's beginnings have had people over the years claim that the lake is cursed or haunted. There's also several reports of flickering lights and other strange borderline paranormal occurrences that happen around the park, but those could be fake and just trying to add to the story. That was the disturbing amusement parks incident Iceberg explained. For sure one of my darker videos, as there was a ton of tragedies in this one. I'll have to make a video on a lighter topic next time. If I forgot anything in this one, please let me know in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching and supporting the channel. That's all from me. Have yourselves a damn good one.